Wow, not a scratch. This thing is powerful. So guys, welcome back to RBR. I'm your host Raz, and say hello to the mayor of M-Town, the most powerful BMW M car. It is the new M8 Competition Coupe. This is a V8 twin-turbo monster with 625 brake horsepower, all-wheel drive, and a switchable rear-wheel drive drift mode as well. Today you get the full review of the M8 Coupe, including looking a little bit back at history, back at the previous M6 that is its predecessor and its internal rival, the brilliant M5 Competition. So let us begin now with the new M8 Competition. So guys, today's episode is sponsored by my favorite sponsor on the channel, because I personally nagged them for over a year to get them on the channel, because I use their product all the time. 2 years on RBR I've been using these shoes, and they are the Piloti driving shoes. Now, last time I showed you these, the brand new Legacy S, based on the Pagani Zonda, you can see here with the lights. Today they've released the brand new Shifts, which are the newer version of what I have. A bit more of a simplified design, but the exact same all-day comfort, as evidenced by the amount of times that I've worn these in almost every single RBR video. So, same concept, even more comfortable, even more simplistic in design. And of course, the purpose of me nagging them so much was to get you guys a discount on what is my favorite shoe. So all you need to do is use the code RBR15. You'll get 15% off your order straight away. They're well worth it, not just for driving, but all day comfort. Enjoy my favorite shoes, guys. We have some history, this car and I. We had some spirited drag races on and off the camera at Car Wow, and already I have respect of its prowess because of that. And that's only grown since I've driven this beast during this review, so stick around later to see just how good this car is. Now, I reviewed the original 8 Series almost a year and a half ago now on RBR. So back then we looked at the 840D, which was the standard version of this car in a diesel. And even that car we found to be really dynamic and fun, despite being just the standard version of the car. And during that review, we also looked at some of the history of the 8 Series, and I think it's quite important for today's car, because even the M version is quite linked to A, how good it looks, and B, the history. So the 8 Series name itself started with the legendary E31 Coupe. Now, when you look at this car, it looked completely different to everything else that BMW was doing back then. That's not so much so the case of our car today, but in spirit, it's following that same idea. Now, this 8 Series actually had an M8 planned at one point, and it was meant to be a real Ferrari fighter. But because of the recession of that time, BMW kind of scrapped the idea, and instead they made an 850 CSI. It was kind of a detuned version of what they'd planned for the M8 back then. Still featured a V12, it had 375 brake horsepower, and as today, that M8 was due to have more power than the M5, and the 850 CSI did have more power than the M5 back then. So that was kind of the spiritual successor directly in terms of name to our car today. After this though, followed the M6, which came about 16 years after the previous M6. This car was from the Chris Bangle era. It had that weird boot on the back, but it had that wonderful V10 as well, which of course was shared with the M5 of the time. But very much a coupe version of the 5 Series, and not that much to differentiate it, hence why it was a 6 Series rather than an 8. Following on from this came our predecessor to this car, at least in spirit. Again, another M6, this one still rear-wheel drive like the previous cars. The competition versions near the end got to 591 brake horsepower, so very potent, but once again, very similar looks to the 5 Series of the time, very similar interior, very similar price point, very similar size. So everything was in accordance still, and regulated, if you like, by the 5 Series. That's not really the case for our car today. As we saw in our original review, just even the dimensions of the new 8 Series are completely different. BMW and BMW M call this a sports car rather than the GT, and the dimensions difference to the 6 Series
kind of explain that. So the car, first of all, is shorter, which you normally wouldn't see in a newer model of a car. Cars tend to grow in size these days. The car is also not as tall as the 6 Series, and the car is significantly wider. So what you're ending up with is a whole different body style just in terms of the car's size. The M8 is thus aimed at a higher market, just like that original E31 8 Series, and the price is reflective of this as well, which is why it starts to become problematic when it seems to be quite similar to the M5 Competition. That is a point that we'll get onto later. But in terms of just the body and chassis, there are big changes versus the 5 Series. For example, we know that the 8 Series has carbon core, which is a mix of materials, including carbon fiber reinforced plastic, aluminium, etc., to make a much lighter and more rigid core, making it lighter than rival GT cars and more rigid and more dynamic when driving fast as well. So that is one initial difference, at least, to the 5 Series. Of course, this is powered by, again, the V8 twin turbo. This has got 625 brake horsepower in this beast, and it goes to 0 to 60 in 3.2 seconds, as I am very aware of, and it is absolutely blistering for a car of this size. But the big difference has to be the MX drive system, which is of course all-wheel drive, but with various levels of rear bias, including a fully rear-wheel drive mode available to the driver. This just sets it completely apart to all the previous M6 cars and puts it on a completely different level, making those cars really a distant memory to today's car. Now, lots of learning has also been brought in from the M8 GTE customer racing car into this car to help BMW configure it more towards track usage. For example, a lot of time has been spent on engine cooling with specific notes towards track usage, for example, extreme longitudinal and lateral acceleration. So although this is able to do the luxury side of things, BMW M have really focused on track use as well. So of course, suspension goes to the heart of every BMW M car. So I'd love to show you what they've done for suspension and dynamics here on the M8. So while we peel away the layers, you can see, for example, we've got use of shear panels, we've got an anti-roll bar, we've got a steel X-brace on the rear, a transverse aluminium strut on the rear as well. We've got M-specific forged links as well. And finally, we've got increased camber on the front. So much done, again, to help with rigidity versus an already dynamic standard 8 Series. Oddly though, there isn't any rear wheel steer as you'd find in the standard versions of the 8 Series, which was something I really liked when I was driving it. So we'll have to see later when we go on our roads how that's affected this. BMW M said that they wanted a more natural feeling, though I do wonder whether that's just to keep things more similar to the M5. Next, we have to come on to design, because as far as I'm concerned, ignoring just the M2 by itself, this has got to be the best looking BMW M car. I absolutely love just how aggressive it looks versus even the standard 8 Series. And you don't tend to get that kind of massive shift, at least in the rivals anymore. AMG in particular making their cars look very similar in between their lightweight versions versus their 63 versions. That's not the case here with the M8 versus, say, the 850i. You can see you've got a really aggressive front end with really big lower intakes. Here we've got carbon package, so you can appreciate it even more. But it's really that styling that was started by both the M2 and that wonderful M8 concept, the one that then translated its green and gold design into a limited edition model in the Grand Coupe. I think that looked absolutely fantastic, and that brings its flavor now into the production version of the M8. So a really aggressive front end, nice traditional looking BMW grille. This might be the one you have to go for if you don't like the one that's going to be on the upcoming M3 and M4. So popular car in the future, I think. Of course, we've got some of the best looking wheels in the entire car market, as usual. Hats off to BMW M for always making the best looking alloys, in my opinion. These look fantastic with gloss black and a nice chamfered edge on the outside. Of course, we've got carbon ceramic brakes on this. Then we've got a unique element here just behind the front wheel arch. Again, M specific, looks great. We've got carbon fiber in that as well. M specific mirror caps as well with that typical M look. We've got a carbon fiber roof with a dip in the middle, again, something that you would traditionally find in sports cars like the AMG GT. And then when you look at the rear, so aggressive, so aggressive. Again, exaggerated M2 or that M8 concept look again, really huge quad pipes, a really slim looking light design. I love the little spoiler on the boot as well, and the lower diffuser, especially in carbon. And this is where then I begin to see why this car is much more attractive than the M5, because the M5 is a sleeper, and you would never ever call the M8 a sleeper. It is in your face, it is low, wide, short, stubby. So just in terms of looks, if you're looking for a car that truly looks like a brutal M coupe, then you would of course pay more to get the M8 versus the M5, in my opinion at least. But still, we do have to decide whether on the road it's different enough to the M5, and whether that exterior styling and interior uniqueness will count enough versus how great the M5 Competition is. So let's find out right now, starting with the interior. Now I'm sure you can half guess what I'm going to say. When you look at this awesome interior, this has got to be a standout feature of the M8, as it was in the 8 Series as well, but you've got plenty of BMW M within this car as well. So let's have a look at some of what makes the M Competition unique. Firstly, I'm super happy that we got a car that isn't just black inside. We've got some nice contrast here with the black nappa and the red nappa leather in this full merino leather interior by BMW M. It's got really lovely, unique stitching, particularly through the middle of these unique M Performance seats. Now these are, again, unique to the M8, and they look great. They are your typical M shape, I think, but in a kind of more luxurious application, particularly with regard to that stitching that I spoke about, and just generally it just looks much more high-end. You've got the lovely lighted M8 logo within the headrest as well, and they are super comfortable. They hug you really well, and you sit in a really driver-centric position. I'm still not a fan of the steering wheel. I think it belongs in a more luxurious car, but I do like the M1 and M2 buttons. They're an immediate giveaway that you are in the proper M version of the 8 Series. And again, more than just looking good, they're useful because you can configure M1 to your liking and M2 to your liking within here in the new setup menu, which again, it allows you to set up so much of the car to your liking, not just the usual engine, chassis and steering, but BMW M have even given you the option of brake feel, which I've not really seen in any other sports car manufacturer. So that's cool. It'll be interesting to see how that works when we're driving as well. All you have to do is tap M1, then you change the settings here, or tap M2, and then you can change them once again and save them. Now there's another option here, which is called M mode, and that has 3 different settings. Road for normal road driving, Sport for more sporty driving, and at that point you get a completely different driver zone here in front, which is specific BMW M in style. And then finally, if you hold it down, you get one called track mode. Now track mode really minimizes any distractions for the driver. That disables heads up, this screen here, and just gives you what you need in your driver zone in front, again with a unique display for the track mode, and that is only for track driving. Again, that focus on taking this M8 to the track by BMW M is very telling. But we will keep it in either road or sport for our review, and we'll see how those differ on the run later on as well. Now it's a very snug interior. When I sit in here, I'm getting flashbacks of my 911 Turbo S. That's how kind of tight it is. In fact, I feel like I almost have less headroom here than I do in my 911, which is kind of weird when you consider how much bigger the M8 seems. It's a similar story in the rear, although you've got actual proper rear seats versus something like a 911 or a DB11, and I feel they've just been a lot more comfortable for my occupants to sit in. I'm talking adult and children in the rear, so you can just about get away with it, but it's by no means a large rear space like, say, the S Coupe might have. So really, again, it's restrictive in terms of just how daily it will be with multiple people. Although the luggage space is great, the space in the rear, you're going to have to think about who you can fit in there for long periods of time. Other M touches I like in here, I like the M8 Competition badge, dead center in the center console, that's pretty cool. You've got a completely redesigned BMW M gear selector here, which is lovely to use. I love the fact that BMW still use significant size and old-fashioned looking gear selectors. That's trimmed with your typical tricolor color as well, which is lovely. I wish a little bit more was done in terms of being able to customize the driver zone in front, but at least I'm happy that when you go through the different M modes, you get different screens in front. That is great. Of course, you can configure the heads up to your liking as well. As far as the in-car BMW system goes, it's very easy to use. It's a touchscreen system, as we've covered in the past with the 8 Series and the M5. I tend to default to Apple CarPlay, which again can be used wirelessly, which is great. But if you want to use the BMW one, it is pretty simple to use. It's pretty powerful. You can configure ambient lighting, wellness, you've got your gesture control. So everything that you would find in your top luxury 7 Series, for example, carries through into the 8 as well. I'm a big fan of the interior. I think this really sets it apart to M5. It just feels really special. And the M5 is kind of, again, it's more sleeper, more run-of-the-mill BMW. This doesn't feel like that at all. It feels like a really special place, particularly when you spec it well. Now, the other thing that sounds special is the startup, but sadly not as special as it used to in the M5. Now, as the car settles, I'll put it into the M2 Sport mode. And you can see the kind of pops and bangs have been restricted on standstill. We'll have to see how much sound we're getting out of the car when we're driving it a bit faster. So let's go and do that right now, because I really need to show you just how quick and capable this car is. So here we go, M8 Competition. This is one of those cars that's been so requested both on YouTube and Instagram, and you can kind of understand why, given my history with the GT63S, which is pretty much the most direct competitor to this car, and then the whole thought process that you guys have of what will Mr. AMG think of an M8 Competition. Now, because of my nickname, people wrongly assume that I don't like M cars, which is just not the case. The M5 and the M2 are some of my favorite performance cars in the world, and you guys will remember how much I loved the X6M back in Arizona as well. And people often ask, why is the channel called Remove Before Race? Well, apart from the obvious link to the Remove Before Flight aesthetic, it's this idea about removing any misconceptions, any bias that you might have before you race, before you drive, before you review a car. And I've really been looking forward to this as well. As I said, other than the M2, it's my favorite M car in terms of just pure looks. And of course, it's got a stonking V8 as well, so I'm naturally biased to those anyway. So we're going to start by going straight into the M mode Sport, which is going to change the dial in front of me into the lovely M specific one, and see, first of all, what does 625 brake horsepower feel like in a big BMW GT? Well, mighty impressive. Now, can you discern the extra horsepower over the M5 Competition? Well, it certainly feels faster. Now, I don't know whether that's because I'm sitting a bit lower in this car. There is something in it. I don't think it's massive because the weights of the car are quite similar, and 10-20 horsepower here or there never really makes a huge difference on the road. But I tell you, it's as addictive to put your foot down and rock into the distance with this thing. It is so fast. That's mighty impressive. Really gives you butterflies. It's so fast. But as I said, in terms of speed, there's not a huge amount in it between this and the M5 Competition. So what does this large GT sports car feel like in terms of handling? Well, so first let's talk about the rear wheel steer that I would definitely feel in a corner like this or this. I don't think I miss it as much as I thought I would. I mean, undoubtedly rear wheel steer gives you that on-rail effect, but most people who try it for the first time find it actually quite weird. So I totally get what Em are saying when they're saying this feels a bit more natural. Though to me, it would have been a great differentiator versus the M5, because like I found in the GT63, which has it over the E63, it helped that larger car just feel that much more nimble in smaller corners. So though the omission of rear wheel steer is quite odd, I don't think it really affects it that much. Now, I've got the steering set to comfort in my M2 mode. Everything else is dialed up to 10. We're certainly quite light in the hands in comfort, as you would expect. Again, I really don't know where the front wheels are or what they're doing until it's too late. Now, I've put the steering into sport. Let's see if that helps things a little bit. Tell you what, actually, the steering is pretty impressive. In the past, I've not really used it because it made things a bit too heavy, but I'm actually finding in this, you know what? It's actually a lot better than it has been in the past. It's not so artificially heavy, and it's not light like in Comfort, and I feel like I'm getting a little bit more confidence as to what the car is doing. If anything, I actually think it feels a bit better than the M5 Competition that I drove. It is pretty incredible just how flat it corners and just how well it's able to manage its weight. Now that shouldn't surprise you too much because big cars and big SUVs have gotten so much better in handling their weight, but BMW M really pride themselves on dynamics, and they should be very happy with this because the car genuinely shrinks around you. Because when you look at the M8, despite its sporty looks, it is a large car. You don't think that it could kind of handle as well as it actually does. There was so much talk about track driving with this car. You kind of roll your eyes at it thinking, really, in a GT car? But this is really, really impressive in the way that it handles itself. The nose is eager to turn in. You get so much power coming out of the corner thanks to the X-Drive system. And you can really define the line that you want to drive in and really stick to it, which you don't normally think that you can in such a large GT. The M8 really supports you, tells the driver, hey, I can do a lot better, go faster. So, super impressed with the handling in this. I do still wish that the steering had a bit more feedback. It's something for them to work on in the future, but the way this car handles is very, very impressive. It is more on the side of GT though. You will not be comparing this to something like 992 anytime soon. But against cars like the M5, like the GT63S, it's right up there as a really, really dynamic two-door coupe. Now, one thing that you will have noticed that I want to touch base on is, of course, sound. Now, the M5 Comp sounded incredible when we last tested it, but I cannot get any pops and bangs or anything in terms of aural excitement other than the revs out of this car. I mean, we're right at the top of the rev limiter now. It's just moaning. And we know that this engine can sound fantastic because it did in the M5 Competition and the M5. Now, why is that the case when they've done it so well in the past? Well, it's not BMW M's fault. It's EU regulations, again, as you've heard me say in the past, making newer cars sound quieter and quieter. So if you really want to get the great sound that this V8 had in the early M5s and M5 competitions, you're going to have to find some kind of aftermarket solution. Now, one side of this car that really differentiates itself from the M5 is just how good it is at doing the other side of things, which is the luxury side. Now, the M5 Competition had a really, really jarring ride, like super jarring. Whereas the normal M5 was so much more comfortable than the E63S and the GT63. The Competition went completely the other way, which in some ways helped it dynamically, but just made it an absolute dog to live with daily. This isn't like that at all. It's still got the dynamism of the M5 Comp, but with this car, when you stick it in just a normal comfort setting, it is so pleasurable to just drive slowly and do motorway miles, do in-town miles. It handles imperfections on the road in a fantastic way. A lot of that has to be, of course, the M-specific suspension, but the standard 8 Series also did that really well. And that gives this a breadth of ability that the M5 Competition simply does not have. Which is weird because, of course, this is not as practical given the size of the seats in the rear. But what it does mean is this is going to be a super companion for long GT trips. So the Mayor of M Town, huge amounts of bandwidth, loads and loads of speed, great dynamic handling ability. As the flagship M car, it needed breadth of ability, and that's what this has. You pair that bandwidth with how good the car looks both outside and in, and those are the reasons why you would choose the M8 over the M5. But not a sports car. This is a Super GT. So I hope you enjoyed that. Please do like, subscribe, hit the bell icon, and I'll see you guys next time.